What would happen if a white man liked a black woman slave, or probably her young daughter who was also a slave? Or what about his wife, the white mistress who held powers over slaves and would often visit plantations, getting impressed by strong black men working there? Well, the result was children of mixed race, whose future was uncertain. Yet the forbidden desires did not stop there. Often, the young sons of the slaveholding families would like to test their powers. Without even thinking about obtaining consent from black women and girls, they would choose force. Therefore, there are records of these instances where a white man, a white woman, or white young boys would abuse their slaves for their pleasures. Yet those books have been suppressed, and this topic is never taught in schools. That's because not only will it make white people embarrassed, but guilty. So, what untold abuse was done with black slaves which can shake anyone today? In this video, let's find out.
The Black History Archives.
Sexual exploitation was not merely an incidental part of slavery. It was a central mechanism of control and power assertion for slaveholders. It was often carried out to assert dominance over the enslaved, relegate them to a subordinate status, and disturbingly, generate economic benefits. The sexual abuse of enslaved black women, in particular, was systemic and widespread. It wasn't just about desire or lust, it was a tool wielded to dehumanize, stripping them of any sense of autonomy. For white men, who were in positions of power, the exploitation of enslaved women was also a way to reinforce their societal dominance and exert control over every aspect of the lives of enslaved people. And the offspring produced from the sexual exploitation of enslaved women represented an economic blessing for slaveholders. Under the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrem, the status of a child followed that of the mother. This meant that the children born to enslaved women, even those fathered by their white masters, were born into slavery. These mixed-race children, often called mulattoes in historical texts, increased the wealth of the enslavers by expanding their enslaved labor force. It was tragic, but this perverse system turned rape into an economic strategy, where the children produced through these violent encounters became human property, further enriching the enslavers. When white wives saw children of mixed race working on the plantations, they could understand what would have happened. And they themselves had plans to settle the scores. In states like Virginia, sexual violence was pervasive, contributing to the state having one of the largest populations of mixed-race enslaved people. By 1850, Virginia counted 44,000 mixed-race individuals, a direct representation of the widespread rape of enslaved women. While some mixed-race individuals may have achieved better treatment due to their lighter skin, their status as slaves remained unchanged, and their existence reflected the brutal system of exploitation. And that's when white women would decide to make their move. Less frequently discussed, but no less significant, is the sexual exploitation of enslaved black men. Often, enslaved men were forced into sexual relations for the purpose of breeding more enslaved children. This practice reduced men to mere studs, stripping them of their humanity and agency. In many cases, enslavers deliberately organized these coerced unions to produce children, increasing their enslaved labor force. In other instances, black men were sexually humiliated as punishment or subjected to assaults by white men or women as an assertion of dominance. You should know that rape laws existed and generally protected only white women. There was no concept of black women slaves and black male slaves considered raped. For example, in 1859, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that an enslaved black man could not be convicted of raping an enslaved black woman because the crime of rape only applied to assaults against white women. This legal loophole left enslaved women and men vulnerable to constant sexual violence, with no recourse or protection. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. In books such as Soul by Walter Johnson and The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist, we examine how the sexual economy was embedded in slavery. Baptist highlights how the cotton boom in the early 19th century led to an increased demand for both labor and reproduction, with many enslavers systematically forcing enslaved women to reproduce to maintain a steady supply of labor. This practice, often termed slave breeding, became a means of maximizing economic gain while further dehumanizing the enslaved. In some cases, this exploitation was generational, as seen in an 1826 case involving two students from the University of Virginia. They abused a 16-year-old black enslaved girl, and after contracting a venereal disease from her, stripped her naked and beat her. This event shows how enslaved women were treated as disposable, their bodies used and discarded at the whims of white men. There was another incident that occurred in 1787 in Maryland, where an enslaved black man was forced at gunpoint by two white men to sexually abuse a free black woman. The trauma of such events, compounded by the impossibility of fighting back, illustrates the far-reaching power enslavers had over the lives of both enslaved men and women. For both men and women, resisting sexual exploitation often led to severe punishment. Those who fought back faced whippings, being sold away from their families, or being sent to the lower South, where life was even more brutal. Separation from loved ones was a common tactic used by enslavers to break the spirit of those who resisted, consigning them to harsher conditions on plantations farther south. One particularly devastating case in Missouri in 1855 involved a young enslaved woman named Celia, who was repeatedly raped by her white enslaver. After enduring years of sexual abuse, Celia eventually killed the man in self-defense. However, the courts refused to recognize her right to defend herself, concluding that enslaved black women had no legal right to resist the sexual advances of their owners. Celia was convicted of murder and subsequently hanged. This case highlights how the legal system denied enslaved women the most basic human right. However, even after slavery was abolished, abuse of black people continued. In May 1870, a horrifying example of a racial nightmare unfolded in North Carolina, where a black woman was raped by 15 white men, and her husband was lynched by the same mob. Days later, in the same community, another black woman was brutally assaulted, raped by a mob of white men, and stabbed in multiple places on her body. Even after the abolition of slavery, the legal system continued to treat the sexual assault of black women differently from that of white women. The Georgia Code of 1861 established mandatory sentences for the rape of white women, but left the punishment of rapes of black women to the discretion of the courts. For example, in October 1866, an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau, an organization established to assist formerly enslaved people, issued arrest warrants for two white men accused of beating a black woman named Sylvie Soylean and killing her son. However, the local sheriff in Louisiana refused to arrest the men, illustrating the failure of law enforcement to protect black women or hold white perpetrators accountable. Similarly, in September 1866, a black woman named Rhoda Ann Childs was targeted in her home by a group of 8 white planters in Georgia. The men initially sought her husband, but upon learning that Mrs. Childs was alone, they kidnapped and sexually assaulted her. According to her affidavit, one of the men held a gun to her and threatened to shoot her, while another man abused her until he became too tired to continue. Following this, a former Confederate soldier raped her, and the mob robbed her home and beat her daughter. But no justice was given to her. Faced with few options, many enslaved women submitted to the sexual demands of their enslavers as a form of survival. To refuse often meant severe punishment or being sold off, leading some women to make peace with their situation in the hopes of securing better treatment for themselves and their children. For example, Harriet Jacobs entered into a long-term relationship with a neighboring white man to stave off the repeated advances of her enslaver, choosing the lesser of two evils in a system where her body was never truly her own. For many women, sexual submission offered a grim path to improved living conditions, such as working in the house as domestic servants rather than in the fields. While this might have afforded them marginally better treatment, it did not erase the exploitation and dehumanization inherent in these relationships. At slave auctions, enslaved women were paraded with their bodies exposed, often stripped naked to advertise their ability to bear children, highlighting their reproductive value to prospective buyers. This practice further dehumanized enslaved women, reducing them to their potential as breeders. Often, the enslaved women's reproductive capacity was compared to livestock breeding. James H. Golson of Brunswick County, Virginia, argued during an 1832 debate that enslavers had a right to the increase of their enslaved women, comparing it to the right of a horse owner to the offspring of broodmares. This comparison reduced human beings to mere economic assets. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, in the same debate, noted that 8,500 enslaved people were exported annually from Virginia to the Deep South. This internal slave trade became a booming industry, further commodifying black bodies as enslavers sought to profit from the breeding of their enslaved workforce. Furthermore, enslavers utilized various methods to encourage enslaved women to bear children, ranging from subtle incentives to outright coercion. For instance, some enslavers would make small presents to enslaved women when they had a baby. In 1792, a Virginia enslaver named B. Talbot promised to emancipate a woman named Jenny and her sixth child if she bore him 5 more children. Tell us, were you taught about this in school, college, or university? Isn't it true that this topic is little talked about, to avoid black people asking questions and to avoid feeling shame by white people? In the comments section right below, let us know if is it bad to tell the young black generation about what happened during slavery. Or should they be told about the reality so they know what their ancestors experienced? Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.